Oh, nothing, just trying to find one angle of my office that isn't messy. Hey there folks, this is a quick little video that I'm trying to make practical for you as an artist. This isn't a hardware review channel, but the perspective that I can offer is that of an artist who has been using the iPad Pro for I think it's actually been 10 whole years now for my professional illustration work. With the announcement of new iPads fresh in mind, I want to both look at what seems to be new with the latest models and how that affects you, past all of the "this is the most bestest thing we've ever put in an iPad" type talk. But also look at sort of the state of viability for the iPad as of this year, if you want to be making stuff on it, 2D, 3D, animation, and how that compares to, say, desktop or laptop with graphics tablets or a screen display. This might have been silly. So before the new iPad Pro was announced, we got what may tend to be the more impactful announcement for newer artists, which is the iPad Air's finally getting that 13-inch version, which means a larger screen for the lower-end model of iPad. My assumption is that, just like the internals, the iPad Air is getting some more hand-me-downs from the last generation of Pros, and what this means is that the price of entry for someone that just wants digital art is now lower. When you take into consideration what it costs to get any sort of laptop or computer and then any Wacom-like drawing tablet, the cost adds up pretty quickly, and that's before you start talking about software, which is typically subscription-based on those platforms. With the iPad, you have a full ecosystem. You buy a pencil, you buy Procreate once for $20, and you're good to go. I will say, though, that I'm not positive about the 13-inch Air being the best value because at $800, you're so close to the Pro and all of the extra power and better screen that it has, and access to the Pencil Pro, which we'll talk about in a second. But at least between the 13-inch Air and 13-inch Pro, you're saving roughly a third of the cost at $400. The best value is probably still the current generation, but year-old regular iPad, which starts at $350, and with the old Pencil and Procreate, you're at about $450. So the exciting new stuff, though, is that the iPad Pro finally has a new model after quite a long time between updates. It seems like it's physically the same dimensions, except they really kept hyping up how it's so much thinner now, which I actually don't really like. A, I don't care about how thin my iPad is, and B, you're talking about how it's now 5 millimeters thick, and it just makes me worried and feel like I need to get a stronger case. I know they said that it's durable and all that, but we might have to see what the stress test people do. I do so much with this thing, and I'm carrying it and taking it with me places and jamming it into my backpack when we travel, and I would just rather it be durable instead of like the case study for the thinnest thing that we can make. I know the latest phones had some issues with that, and that's a much smaller rectangle, and I remember some older iPad Pro models dealing with bending. And I don't know, I just don't want thinner. Anyway, it also has what they call an Ultra XDR screen, or what seems like 2 levels of OLED, or OLED. First of all, that's great. Having a better, brighter, more color-accurate screen as an artist is just a full-on win. One of the things people worry about with OLED is burn-in of constantly occurring elements. Like, I would be concerned about the Procreate interface starting to burn in after a few thousand working hours in it every year. However, friend of the channel Bob Wolf's been burning in an OLED Nintendo Switch screen constantly for a few years now, and it took so long of being constantly on displaying the same image to start to show signs of wear that it's essentially a non-issue for likely everyone not doing that specific experiment. They're also offering an anti-glare option for the screen, which, much like the Pro displays, is apparently an $800 additional cost. However, I could see especially people working in daylight, photographers, cinematographers, it's not a bad option. Definitely just one of those specialty things. The most exciting things for artists, though, are twofold. The first is the M4 chip, and the second is the Pencil Pro. Now, at one point when the iPad Pro was new, apps like Procreate were limited in the number of layers that you could work on because of the limitations of the hardware. So the big thing when you got a new iPad Pro was just how many new layers you could use per document. It was really exciting. And it's probably the same kind of thing as like once you've experienced food scarcity or food poverty, you never quite unlearn it, because even though layer count still feels like such a big deal to artists naturally, I actually haven't encountered the layer limit in years. If you work at a high enough resolution, if you're making a big enough animation, you can start to hit those limits. But between the hardware improving and the software improving, including what Procreate said about their architecture being overhauled during the Dreams announcement, which will make the app be able to essentially use infinite layers, it's almost a non-issue now. Forgot to turn on one of my lights. There you go. Now you can see more shingles. However, being the first product with an M4, sparing any technical details, it future-proofs this iPad quite a bit and makes it super, super fast. And second is that delicious new Apple Pencil Pro. But first, speaking of making the iPad work for you as an artist, this video is brought to you by Paperlike. Paperlike is a high-quality screen overlay for the iPad that's meant to mimic the feel and sound of writing on paper. So when I was first using the iPad Pro, I tried the more generic matte screen protectors, but it didn't really make any difference, and I actually found that I had to replace my Apple Pencil tips every couple of weeks. Paperlike's texture, on the other hand, is a whole other level, and I've been using it for years before they reached out to sponsor this video. If you've ever referred to drawing on the iPad as rubbing a bar of soap on a piece of glass or something like that, I think this should interest you. A Paperlike provides just enough subtle texture and resistance to give you better and more natural control over the pencil, and it reduces fingerprint smudging and reflective glares that you'd get from the bare glass. When you get Paperlike, you'll get 2 covers and a whole system that makes it so you have a nice, clean application with no dust or bubbles. They ship worldwide and accommodate all sizes of iPad, including the newly announced ones. You can check the link in my description below to grab a Paperlike of your own, and thanks to Paperlike for sponsoring this portion of the video. All right, Apple Pencil Pro. The 2 biggest features of this are a physical button, which you can squeeze, and that activates a little haptic feedback as you do so, and barrel roll, which means you can not just tilt, which we've had, but roll your brushes and essentially add rotational control to apps. These were demonstrated through a spot from our good buddies James and Nikolai from Savage there in the background, both in Procreate and Procreate Dreams. Now, a feature that has been part of the last iPad Pro, but is new to me since I skipped the last generation, is the hover. You don't need to physically be touching the screen to see your cursor. So now with the button, they're showing that through the quick menu gestures and layer select tools, that you're able to really significantly speed up the amount of steps and amount of time that you're spending selecting and using tools. Now, to me, the microseconds that add up over use of those features are going to be the absolute biggest help to me in my process. It's so small, but it means the most to someone who is constantly drawing in Procreate. They also showed off the barrel roll in action, both in brush rotation and the perform mode in Dreams, being able to simultaneously control both movement and rotation, and a few new features in Dreams, attributing them to the M4 chip. However, I sincerely doubt that new features in Dreams will be locked to specific models of iPad. And speaking of being locked to specific models of iPad, this was the thing I saw the most sort of disappointment about from people, which is that the Apple Pencil Pro won't work on the M2 iPad, the previous model, only this newly released one and the Air, which being able to be used on the Air kind of makes you wonder, like, why can't it work on the M2? Is it a technical limitation? Is it something anti-consumer? I don't know. I would probably be more upset if I hadn't skipped the previous version, but that seems to be the reality. At least you can use your old Apple Pencil with the M4. Oh yeah, there's also the AirTag, like, find my function in the pencil now for all y'all people that aren't just putting your pencil back in place. Get a case that doesn't make you choose between charging and storing, and you're good. But this is nice, just in case. I'm kidding, I think I've lost my pencil before. So this was heralded as like a revolutionary change to the iPad. I don't know that I'd go quite so far, but it was a significant enough amount of new features that, to me, who owns an art business, to see the new iPad as a worthwhile investment and business expense. Does that mean that you need to buy the newest and shiniest iPad in order to be a better artist? You probably haven't been watching this channel long if you think that I'd say yes to that. It's so easy to convince ourselves that the secret to improving our skills lies in new shiny objects, but it is almost never true, and it ends up distracting us from actual disciplinary growth in our skills. One more thing that I'll mention about this presentation. For a while now, as different tech companies all jump to integrate AI into their software and kind of use it as some sort of feature, like as the trendy new buzzword that magically makes the company money or something, people have kind of been elevating Apple above all of the rest because they hadn't really dipped their toes in the AI sphere. Maybe the hope was that they are too good for it. This presentation really brought all of that back crashing down to earth. 2 caveats here. A lot of people, because they see me using the Apple ecosystem of products, I advocate for how great the iPad and specifically Procreate is, and equate that to me being an Apple fanboy. I'm not. I simply care about whatever is offering the best quality and ease of use. Maybe something is cheaper and more powerful, but it might cause more friction in use cases. Second thing, another misconception around artists' fervent hatred of machine learning generated images is that they think all AI is bad, and that's not true at all. The key issue tends to stem from copyrighted work being stolen without consent and being used to train machine learning models. So when a company like Apple ends up saying AI at least like a dozen times in this presentation, usually what they were referring to was their neural engine, and that's largely responsible for more intensive smart tasks that I'm glad are automated. The example in Final Cut of the background isolation, that's awesome. That's the kind of thing that quote-unquote AI should be used for. Like, I see the term AI being used kind of in place of algorithm or processing, sort of like how the word app replaced the completely identical word program or software. And if Apple name-dropping AI a dozen times like someone was holding them at gunpoint off screen, if that was the only inclusion, I'd sort of roll my eyes and go, yeah, they're just trying to be cool, I guess. Except that the first example of AI that they used was during the iPad Air announcement talking about machine learning generated images. And I guess, to be fair, it is possible, and of anyone this might be the most likely company to do it, that this was actually an ethically licensed dataset. But it's still like, really? It feels dumb and contradictory to be talking in the same breath about how the iPad empowers creatives and artists, and then like, boom, generative AI. It's still nowhere near as stupid as whatever Adobe has been doing for the last 2 years. Adobe is absolutely dead in the water with respect to any goodwill owed to them by artists, but Apple, getting a little side-eye. Don't think we don't care. This sort of brings us into the next section of this video. For people maybe curious about the ecosystem of being a creative on iPad, is it really viable? In the middle of this presentation, they actually name drop ZBrush for iPad. And I'm thinking to myself, did I miss that this exists? Only to find that the only thing ZBrush had announced was an announcement that it was coming. So that's an app that I guess we can expect later this year. But you don't have to wait to start sculpting in 3D on the iPad, which we'll talk about in a second. The main comparison here, for all intents and purposes, should you get an iPad instead of a PC for digital art? The answer kind of depends, but with each generation of iPad and iPad OS, the line blurs more and more. For drawing and illustration and for comics, everything can be done in Procreate. Alternative apps include Clip Studio, which is by subscription, and Adobe Fresco, which is made by Adobe. If the iPad was all you had, you're looking at everything that you need, from full-featured software to file format compatibility with industry standards, all while being a high-quality display tablet that you can take with you anywhere. I end up doing a lot of illustration work on that little couch over there because it's nice and I don't necessarily have to be at my desk. But with a few additional things like a paper-like screen protector and a surface like the Sketchboard Pro or the much more adult and aesthetically sophisticated Sketch Slate, you're set up with a comic or illustration studio. If you're trying to make things with vectors, there's of course the Affinity suite of apps if you're focused on graphic design, Pixaki if you want to do pixel art. I have seen good things about an app called Resprite as well that resembles the interface of a sprite. So the most definitively of all of these categories that we're talking about for 2D art, there isn't any compromise if you're using an iPad. But what about animation? That's where things start to get a little bit more up in the air. Thankfully, with the release of Procreate Dreams, there's a much wider availability of animation tools on the iPad, and the way that it integrates with Procreate is great. The app is still in its early days. For a precedent, Procreate took a few years to really get to where it is now. And so there's features and aspects that aren't as ideal as some full-fledged desktop animation apps that have a head start in feature integration and iteration. And as for industry viability, I have heard of a few smaller studios commit to making full-fledged productions in Dreams, but it will still be a while before you see the animation industry move towards something like it as the standard, since the collaborative process of animation tends to include a lot of Toon Boom Harmony for syncing across multiple users, TV Paint, and other desktop apps. For me personally, I've talked in the past about how I'm using Procreate Dreams for my animated series Stormfellers, but that's mainly as effects work over top of existing 3D animation from Blender. And speaking of 3D, where's the iPad at there? But you don't have to wait for ZBrush to release on the iPad to experience 3D sculpting that's just as intuitive as Procreate is for 2D work. Nomad Sculpt is a great program for making high-res sculpts. I haven't personally been able to dig too deep into it, but you can check out Jerome Vogel or Drug Free Dave's content to see what they've been able to achieve with it. What's great with Nomad is that in addition to vertex painting and lighting setups to get good-looking renders, and of course you can export 3D models to Procreate to texture over top of, you can also export for 3D printing. I would assume that even if you lacked a PC, that you would be able to load an SD card or USB stick into the USB-C port, pull the file onto the card and print from there, if you didn't have to first slice the model in a slicer program to get it prepared for printing. You're this close to being able to do that. For the rest of 3D, it seems like the recently released Valence 3D is being well regarded as a modeling app. There's also Shaper 3D for precision CAD modeling, but it does seem like full-featured Blender for iPad is still a ways away. And I think the expectation that an iPad would be able to replace a PC for 3D work right now is a little bit silly, but the amount of things that it can still do while you're not at a desk is still substantial. And you have the ability to hook an iPad up to your Mac and probably PC with varying degrees of success to use it as a pressure-sensitive screen display that you can still take with you. Ooh, also one last bonus thing that might counteract a large part of this video for some of you is some recent preliminary tweets from the head of Procreate, James. They're talking about Procreate for desktop. I mean, you'd hear a million Photoshop subscriptions cry out in pain all at once and then be immediately silenced, if that happened. Obviously, this is still a ways away, but for the amount of time I've seen people asking for desktop Procreate, the fact that they're actually talking about it now is definitely very exciting. Remember, I just want to get this out there. I'm not a tech reviewer. I am a professional who has something that works for them. So anytime people comment things like, well, why don't you use this, or this thing is cheaper, even if I was going to be getting a one-to-one lateral change in quality or even an improvement, I think something people don't really realize or talk about is the expense and luxury of time that it takes to pivot. And it's not just talking about money. I've pivoted before from Lightwave 3D to Maya to Blender, and it isn't a simple thing. Because I really like the iPad for a lot of my digital art needs. I likely won't change out of that unless something remarkably better came along, and right now I'm not sure what that would mean since the current stuff is already pretty ideal. Again, I can't stress enough that new tools are great, but skill building is better, and the majority of the time on this channel, that's what we're talking about. So I'll now return you to your regularly scheduled character design Forge videos, including topics like, ooh, whoa, it thinks you should watch this one right here. See y'all soon, thanks for watching, and have fun creating.